So my name's Gideon Hirschfield. I'm a hepatologist in Toronto, Canada. I'm the director of the Autoimmune and Rare Liver Disease program at Toronto General Hospital. That program cares for patients with primary biliary cholangitis, primary sclerosing cholangitis, and autoimmune hepatitis, as well as other rare liver diseases. The goal of our program is threefold: care, teaching, and research. So we care for our patients, we teach the next generation of trainees, but importantly, we contribute to clinical trials and translational science. And in that context, we have a long interest in quality of life and developing therapies that improve the patient experience, which is particularly relevant for people living with PBC, which has a high symptom burden. Primary biliary cholangitis is probably best considered actually a common rare condition because around 1 in 1,000 women over the age of 40 live with it. So although that is rare, it's not ultra rare. And what happens in primary biliary cholangitis is the immune system attacks the small bile ducts and you have a lymphocytic cholangitis. And when you have this lymphocytic cholangitis from the immune system, you get bile duct destruction, bile duct obstruction, and progressive biliary scarring and eventually cirrhosis. But alongside that, you get the consequences of cholestasis. And the consequences of cholestasis for a patient is a detriment to their quality of life. And that quality of life detriment can include itch, which is actually a specific symptom of cholestatic liver disease. It's a very difficult itch. It's the itch where scratching doesn't help. It's an itch where the therapies are not particularly effective at present time. There's also other associated symptoms that includes fatigue, impaired sleep, arthralgias, abdominal discomfort. So, from a patient perspective, when you're living with PBC, you've got these abnormal blood tests, you've got a diagnosis and then treatment to try and change the disease course. But important to you is the treatment for symptoms as well, including itch, which is why we've been so keen to be involved in clinical trials that are actually tackling itch as a prime reason for the trial beyond disease modification. Doing clinical trials for itch is very difficult. And this is probably the largest ever global phase 3 randomized controlled clinical trial where the point of entry is being itchy. And so patients around the world had to have moderate to severe itch, and they knew that they were going to be randomized to drug or placebo, and they were going to be followed up over the duration of the trial, testing the hypothesis that linerixibat, a drug that had been developed already in phase 2A and phase 2B, it's an IBAT inhibitor, was going to be tested with the endpoint being, do they feel better? Do they itch less? And what happens to their overall itch scores, sleep-related interference, and quality of life? And so this was a really big undertaking because you needed to go around the world for a rare disease. You needed to accept that there's lots of existing therapies for PBC and itch, and you couldn't exclude those. And therefore, you need to find patients who were committed, who would also very carefully document their itch using very carefully constructed scales that are quite complicated, actually, because these scales have to be designed from a regulatory perspective to make sure that at the end of the study, you've really proved to your case that the drug, an IBAT inhibitor, a drug that delivers bile acids to the colon, and instead of letting the bile acids recirculate to the liver, makes the patient less itchy. So I was lucky enough to be the lead presenter on behalf of the investigators and the patients and the sponsor. And the study met its primary endpoint. And the primary endpoint was the improvement in worst itch over 24 weeks. It's a complex regulatory defined scale, but there was statistical significantly less itch in patients treated with linerixibat over 24 weeks. That effect was seen as early as week 2, and that was also statistically significant. And then the other key secondary endpoint was improvement in sleep as a consequence of less itch. And that was also clearly demonstrable in the trial versus placebo. And when one looked at the actual data over 24 weeks, you could see rapid and sustained improvements in pruritus with linerixibat. And moreover, at the end of 24 weeks, there was a crossover where patients crossed over depending on what treatment they've been allocated for the first 24 weeks. And when you took patients who had been on placebo and you crossed them over to linerixibat without them knowing, their itch got better. And when you took patients who'd been on linerixibat and crossed them over to placebo, again, without them knowing, their itch got worse. So I think this was testament to a very rigorous and robust clinical trial design, testament to all the patients from around the world, including patients in China and Japan, to demonstrate that IBAT inhibition, linerixibat, is an oral non-absorbed IBAT inhibitor. As I said, it delivers the bile acids to the colon, not recirculating them back to the liver, is an effective therapy, we hope, for the specific treatment of pruritus in primary biliary cholangitis. I think it is exciting. I think it's very difficult to develop new drugs for any disease. It's very difficult to develop new drugs for rare disease. And there's clearly an unmet need for people living with PBC who are itchy. Otherwise, we wouldn't have been able to find patients who, despite existing therapies, were willing to take part in the study. So I hope what we see now with the study meeting its primary and secondary endpoints is the ability for the sponsor to take this to regulatory agencies and to do their due process they need to do to take the drug to the next step. This is supported by the fact that this drug's been in development through phase 2A and 2B, and there were no new safety signals in this phase 3 clinical trial. So the same mechanistic side effects that were reported in phase 2 were seen in phase 3. So with all that put together, we're optimistic that in the future for people living with PBC, they'll have an opportunity to choose to have therapies that targets a very impactful symptom for them. And we know that up to 80% of patients are symptomatic in PBC, and that we also know that whatever we measure in a clinical trial really is an underestimate of what it's like living with itch. And therefore, we should all be optimistic that the toolbox that we have for treating people with PBC, both disease modification and symptom modification, is, we hope, going to get larger, more in depth, and more effective. I think the only topics I think are important for people to understand is you've got to look beyond the data. When you do clinical trials like this, you really are focusing on rigor. And rigor in doing a symptom study is a lot harder than people would think, because you have to measure symptoms really in a very way that isn't actually how patients report them to you in clinic. And so, for us as investigators, we were really thrilled to be part of such a rigorous effort around the world, because we know just from listening to patients that IBAT inhibition, including linerixibat, makes their itch get better. And so we were really pleased that we were able to measure it, because measuring something is very different to listening to your patient experience in clinic. And so I think the investigators who took part in the study and colleagues who have used drugs like linerixibat and other similar drugs in very rare pediatric liver disease are really convinced that this novel mechanism of action is a treatment for pruritus, which we hope our patients will get access to in the future.